The ordinary complaints reassured me. They also disguised how carefully he watched the door whenever footsteps passed in the hallway. The next morning, we went to his bank. Dad was still the account owner. He carried current identification, understood every question, and requested his own statements. Grant's power of attorney did not erase Dad's authority over his money, regardless of how often Grant had behaved as if it did. The branch manager printed 11 pages. Dad read them the way he once examined a damaged engine, slowly. Twice, looking for the first part that had failed rather than the loudest symptom. Between November and March, $187 had left his accounts. $46,000 was categorized as care and household expenses. Some of that could have been legitimate, but Crest Haven's billing ledger accounted for less than half of it. $89,000 had been wired in 3 transfers to GM Capital Holdings LLC. The company was registered to Grant and shared an address with his mortgage office. The remaining $52 went to a loan servicer attached to a Florida condominium Lydia and Grant had purchased in 2022. Dad had approximately $25 left. For most people, those numbers would have produced shouting. Dad did not shout. He placed both palms on the table and stared at a coffee stain left by some earlier customer. Your mother and I saved that money in pieces, he said. $20 when the furnace lasted another year. $50 when we stayed home instead of taking a vacation. Overtime she never complained about. Money is rarely only money after a lifetime. It is postponed pleasure, tolerated exhaustion, and all the mornings someone went to work when staying in bed would have been easier. The manager brought us one more document. A $150 home equity line of credit had been requested against Dad's house. The application was still pending and carried Samuel Whitaker's signature dated April 14. On April 14, Dad had been at Crest Haven. Nearly 3 hours away, the facility's records showed no outside appointment, no authorized transportation, and no visitor from the lender. He touched the signature with one finger. That isn't mine. The money already taken hurt him. The house application frightened him. The house was where Mom's mantel clock waited, where 2 daughters had measured their height against a pantry door, and where Dad believed he would live until he personally chose otherwise. I called Lydia that evening. Tell me your side, I said. I'll listen without interrupting. For 1 second, I heard something beneath her anger, fear, perhaps, or exhaustion finally running out of disguises. Then Grant spoke in the background, and her voice hardened. You were never really part of this family. Nora, you visited, I stayed. Don't lecture me about what Dad owed the people who took care of him. Did he authorize those transfers? I'm not discussing private finances with you. They're his finances. She ended the call. Dad had listened from the kitchen doorway. I apologized, although I was no longer certain what I was apologizing for. You gave her a door, he said. She chose not to walk through it. The following morning, we met Evelyn Price, an elder law attorney in Columbus. Evelyn was 63, wore reading glasses on a silver chain, and listened without offering the easy outrage people sometimes mistake for support. When we finished, she folded her hands. Documents don't become truthful because families cry over them, she said. That is why we begin with documents. Dad liked her immediately. Evelyn moved in a precise order. Dad signed a notarized revocation of every existing power of attorney. Copies were formally delivered to Grant, the bank, Crest Haven, Dad's investment custodian, and the county recorder because real property authority had been asserted. Evelyn sent a signature dispute notice to the HELOC lender. The application was frozen before any funds were released. She helped Dad submit a bank fraud affidavit and an adult protective services report. Then requested preservation of the bank, facility, notary, and electronic access records. Only after the urgent protections were in place did she explain the harder part. Civil recovery is one question, she said. Criminal intent is another. Grant may claim your father verbally approved the transfers. I didn't, Dad said. I believe you. Now we prove it in a way strangers cannot dismiss as a family disagreement. The bank's file contained something none of us had seen, a second power of attorney dated January 12. Unlike the limited document Dad had signed after surgery, this one granted Grant broad authority over investments, gifts, loans, and real estate. Dad studied the signature. It carried his name. It did not carry his hand or his consent. Evelyn placed the two powers of attorney side by side. The legitimate document was narrow, witnessed, and signed awkwardly with Dad's left hand while his right wrist was immobilized. The January document was expansive. It allowed Grant to transfer property, make gifts, borrow against the house, and act with almost no practical supervision. Its signature was elegant. Too elegant, Dad said. I have never written my own name that politely. Appearance alone would not prove forgery. Evelyn wanted dated records, original signatures, the notary journal, location evidence, and a clear chain of custody. She instructed us not to confront Grant again and not to remove anything from Dad's house without documenting where it had been found. 2 days later, Dad and I drove to Millstone while Grant was at work. Dad's key still opened the back door. The air inside smelled closed and unfamiliar. File drawers in the den hung open. Elaine's jewelry box sat empty on the guest room dresser, and a suitcase lay unzipped beside it. Dust covered the dining table. On the mantel, the wooden clock had stopped. Dad crossed the room before taking off his coat. He wound the clock slowly, but the mechanism only clicked once and fell silent. 7 months, he whispered. Nobody bothered. He went to the bedroom and pulled an old army footlocker from beneath the bed. Grant had opened almost everything else, but the steel box remained locked. Inside were Dad's discharge papers, the original deed, his medals wrapped in one of Mom's handkerchiefs, and an envelope bearing Elaine's handwriting. For Sam, when I can't say it myself. Dad set the letter aside unopened. At the kitchen table, we compared the disputed power of attorney with his military discharge form and the deed. Across 5 decades, his genuine signatures shared the same habits. The S leaned forward, the crossbar in Whitaker extended beyond the final letters. His pen pressed harder at the end, leaving a small tail in the ink. The January signature had none of those features. It was round, balanced, and careful, the work of someone imitating a name rather than remembering how it felt to write it. But handwriting was only an argument. The date became evidence. After leaving Crest Haven, Dad had signed a medical release naming me as his healthcare contact. I requested his orthopedic records. On January 12, from 9 o'clock until 11:30 in the morning, he had been at the Dayton clinic for a procedure involving light sedation. Nurses documented his arrival, medication, vital signs, and discharge. The disputed power of attorney claimed he personally appeared before a Millstone notary at 10:15 that same morning. The locations were more than an hour apart. Dad could not have occupied both rooms. When Evelyn reviewed the records, she did not celebrate. This is strong evidence, she said. It supports the forgery report and destroys any innocent explanation for the document's timing. But investigations move slowly. Do not confuse strong evidence with instant consequences. Dad nodded. He had spent his life repairing machines and understood that identifying a failed part was not the same as rebuilding the engine. Back at my apartment, he finally opened Mom's letter alone beside the window. He read it twice. When he returned to the kitchen, his eyes were red, but his voice was steady. Your mother wrote, "Don't let quiet people fool you, and don't you disappear inside your own silence." That Friday, Crest Haven's certified discharge notice reached Grant. My phone began filling with voicemails. Grant accused me of removing a vulnerable adult without authorization. In the next message, he used the word kidnapping. By the 4th, he threatened to file an emergency guardianship petition, claiming Dad was confused and I was manipulating him for his estate. Evelyn arranged an independent capacity evaluation immediately. The evaluation was not a memory test. A physician would assess whether Dad understood his property, his choices, and the consequences of those choices. Capacity belongs to the decision being made. Age, stubbornness, and weakness do not erase it. That distinction mattered because Grant's defense depended on turning Dad's inconvenience into incapacity and my concern into control. Sam will likely pass, she said, but a guardianship filing can still create delay, expense, and public doubt. Delay may be what Grant wants. That night, Lydia texted me. Dad will choose the people who stayed. He'll remember which daughter built her life around him. I showed Dad because we had made a new rule: no one would manage information on his behalf again. He read the message and returned my phone. She thinks staying close to someone is the same as standing beside him. Then he looked toward the silent clock we had brought from Millstone. Call Arthur, he said. Tell him I need the favor he's owed me since 1976. The independent physician evaluated Dad the next morning. She asked him to explain his assets, the revoked power of attorney, the proposed HELOC, and what might happen if he made no changes. Dad answered every question and corrected her when she misstated the year he sold the shop. Her written conclusion was direct. Samuel Whitaker possessed full decision-making capacity. Grant could still file for guardianship, Evelyn explained, but he could no longer rely on vague impressions of age or weakness. He would have to challenge an independent medical opinion and Dad's demonstrated understanding in court. Dad read the report, folded it once, and placed it beside Mom's letter. Then we drove to Arthur Bell's house. The favor dated back to an ice storm in 1976. Arthur's car had left a county road and rolled into a drainage ditch. Dad, home from the army less than 2 years, crawled through a broken rear window and pulled him out before leaking fuel reached the engine. Arthur had spent 50 years insisting he owed Dad his life. Dad had always answered, "Then try not to waste it." Arthur listened to everything on his back porch, his coffee untouched between both hands. When Dad finished, Arthur remained silent for nearly 10 seconds, which was the closest he ever came to delivering a speech. "You want me to help announce your death?" Arthur looked at me, expecting the nurse to declare the idea impossible. I could only tell him that Dad understood the risks. Capacity meant respecting decisions I disliked, not replacing them with choices that made me feel safer. "No," Dad said, "I want you to let them announce it themselves." The distinction mattered. Dad's plan would create no death certificate, obituary, insurance claim, police report, government filing, or request for donations. Arthur would make one private call to Lydia and say only what was true in the most dangerous possible order. Sam had collapsed from exhaustion earlier that evening, he was no longer at Cresthaven, and the VFW planned to hold a memorial gathering on Sunday. If Lydia asked whether Dad was dead, Arthur would not lie. If she asked where he was or demanded to speak to him, the plan ended. Dad believed she would ask neither question. The VFW often held tribute gatherings for veterans who were ill, moving away, or recently deceased. Arthur could arrange a private remembrance without filing anything official. His sons still operated the funeral home, and one display casket, empty, closed, and clearly listed in their inventory as a ceremonial loan, could stand at the front of the hall. It was theater, but every prop would be documented. Evelyn refused to direct the plan. "I am your attorney, not your stage manager," she said. "I will continue the fraud referrals and protect your legal interests. I will not tell anyone you are dead, conceal you from a court, or encourage another person to commit a crime." Dad accepted those boundaries. Evelyn also warned that publicly using a suspicious document would not guarantee an arrest or conviction. It could, however, create witnesses, preserve statements, and make it harder for Grant to later describe the forged will as a draft he never intended to use. "No one is to bait him into presenting it," she said. "If he brings it voluntarily, that choice must be his." Arthur would invite Lydia and Grant as family. The gathering would be described simply as a memorial for Sam. Evelyn might attend as Dad's counsel and a community member, carrying certified copies of the revocation and medical records. She would not know the exact moment Dad intended to appear. I asked what the plan was supposed to accomplish that the bank records had not. Dad looked across Arthur's yard toward a row of maple trees. "They took more than money," he said. "They told me where I could live, who I could call, And whether my own memory counted. Then they told you I didn't want you. His voice remained calm, which made the pain inside it harder to avoid. If this stays in an office, Grant will call it a misunderstanding and Lydia will call it sacrifice. I want the people they lied to about me to see me make my own decision. I worried that the performance would make him look vindictive or confused. I worried Lydia would break in a way that could never be repaired. Most of all, I worried that my guilt had made me willing to confuse revenge with justice. Dad listened. Justice isn't humiliation, he said. We don't shout. We don't threaten. We let them speak. Then I speak for myself. Arthur finally lifted his coffee. What flowers? Lilies. Elaine hated lilies. Dad almost smiled. She won't mind missing this one. Arthur reached for his phone. Arthur made the call Thursday evening with Dad and me seated across from him. Lydia, he began, using the measured voice that had carried difficult news through 40 years of funeral work. It's about your father. Sam collapsed earlier tonight. I'm sorry. He's gone from where he was staying. The Post is holding a memorial for him Sunday. Silence filled the speaker. Lydia did not ask whether Dad was breathing. She did not ask where he had been taken or whether she could see him. Her first question was, did he have anything with him? His wallet or any papers? Dad's hand tightened once around his coffee cup. Arthur said any personal matters could be handled later. Lydia thanked him and ended the call. 23 minutes afterward, Grant left an after-hours message for the HELOC lender asking whether a borrower's death would delay disbursement. We learned that later from records preserved during the fraud investigation. Friday morning brought the call with which this story began. At 6:18, Lydia told me Dad had died, claimed the house and accounts, and warned me not to expect anything. Grant told me to let the people who stayed handle the family. Dad sat at my kitchen table listening. I muted the call when he leaned toward the phone. You buried the wrong man. Sweetheart, he said. Then I unmuted it and told Lydia I would attend the memorial. We saved Dad's answer for Sunday. By 9, Lydia had posted a black and white photograph online. Rest easy, Daddy, your girl was with you until the end. The photograph showed Dad in the same green shirt from February. The blue CHM picture sat behind him. The beige handrail crossed the wall at the same height. And a clock above the doorway displayed 4:07. I opened every picture Lydia had sent since Christmas. 3 photographs had different captions and different dates. But the folds in Dad's shirt never changed. The picture remained in the same position. Every clock read 4:07. Her months of proof had been manufactured during one visit to Crest Haven. The discovery did not make me triumphant. It made me imagine Dad sitting patiently while Lydia captured enough versions of his face to impersonate an entire season of care. Saturday morning, Marjorie Hale, Dad's neighbor on Maple Street, called me. A locksmith's van was parked outside his house. Grant was having the locks changed before any court had recognized a will or appointed an estate representative. Evelyn documented the time, contacted the locksmith company, and notified them in writing that Sam was alive and remained the legal owner. The work stopped before the back lock was replaced. Later, Crest Haven received a request from Grant for Dad's records for estate administration. The facility refused without proper authority and preserved the request. Greed was doing what Dad predicted. It was moving faster than grief and leaving receipts. Sunday afternoon, 60 folding chairs faced the front of the Millstone VFW hall. Arthur arranged a framed photograph of Dad in uniform beside the empty ceremonial casket. Lilies stood everywhere, their sweetness thick in the warm room. Dad wore his only dark suit. His VFW pin shone on his lapel. We waited in a storage room behind the stage, able to see the hall through a narrow opening beside the door. Evelyn sat in the last row with a briefcase on her knees. Denise arrived quietly and took a seat near the back. From behind the door, I watched people who had known Dad before Lydia and I were born. Men from the Post removed their caps. Women from Mom's church carried casseroles wrapped in foil. Marjorie Hale sat beside the pastor, holding a handkerchief. Their sadness was real, and that made our deception heavier. Dad seemed to feel it too. He whispered each person's name as they entered. Not like an audience being counted, but like a debt of trust he intended to repay before the afternoon ended. That responsibility sat heavily between us in silence. Lydia entered in a new black dress and shoes that still carried store creases. Grant followed in his best closing suit, accepting condolences with one hand while holding a document folder beneath the other arm. They sat in the front row. At 2 o'clock, Arthur stepped to the microphone. Before we share our memories of Sam, his family has asked to say a few words about his affairs. They had requested the speaking time themselves. Grant approached the podium and opened his folder. Sam believed family should honor a man's final wishes. He began. He produced a will dated April 20th. It left Dad's house, truck, accounts, and commercial property to Lydia and Grant. It left me nothing for reasons known to her. The room shifted. Dad had spoken proudly about both daughters for decades. Even people who knew our family's fractures could hear that the language did not sound like him. Grant smiled when he read my disinheritance aloud. Arthur leaned toward the microphone. April 20th, you said? Behind the stage, Dad placed one hand on the doorknob. The latch clicked. The side door opened, and my father walked into his own memorial. He moved slowly, not from weakness but intention. His shoes struck the old wooden floor one measured step at a time. The room seemed to lose its ability to breathe. A foil-covered casserole slipped from someone's hands. A woman from Mom's church crossed herself. Denise made one startled sound that was half laugh and half sob. For the first time, the gathering stopped being about a man's possessions and became about the man himself. Lydia rose from the front row and stopped moving. Grant remained at the podium with the forged will lifted in his hand. Dad reached the empty casket and examined it. Nice box, Arthur. A little roomy for me. Then he adjusted the microphone and faced Grant. Dead men don't sign papers, son. They also don't surrender their houses. Grant recovered first. This proves exactly what we warned everyone about. He said, Sam is confused. Nora removed him from care and manipulated him. This performance is evidence of instability. He pointed at me as if accusation could restore the room he had lost. Dad did not argue. He simply stepped away from the microphone and let Evelyn stand. She placed certified documents on the table beside the guest book. Mr. Whitaker's independent capacity evaluation was completed Friday. She said, he understands his property, relationships, and legal decisions. No court has found him incapacitated. And no guardian has been appointed. Next came the notarized revocation of all powers of attorney, already delivered to Grant and every relevant institution. Then Evelyn displayed the January power of attorney. This document claims Mr. Whitaker appeared before a notary in Millstone at 10:15 a.m. on that date. Medical records place him under light sedation at an orthopedic clinic more than an hour away from 9 until 11:30. The hall remained silent. She laid out the bank summary, $187 transferred in 5 months. Including $89 sent to Grant's company. She presented the frozen $150 HELOC application bearing Dad's disputed signature on a day. Crest Haven's transportation and visitor logs showed he never left the facility. Finally, she turned toward the will in Grant's hand. You stated it was signed April 20th. Crest Haven's records show Mr. Whitaker received no visitors that week. Who witnessed it? Grant looked toward the 4th row. Martin Cole, a loan processor from Grant's office, lowered the casserole dish resting on his knees. You told me it was routine estate paperwork. Martin said, I never saw Sam sign anything. Grant's face changed, not into guilt, but calculation deprived of time. No one consented to this setup. He said, you people trapped us. No one asked you to bring that will. Evelyn replied, you requested the microphone and presented it voluntarily. The audience heard what you chose to say. Lydia turned on Arthur. You told me he was dead. Arthur's expression remained sad. I said Sam was gone from where he had been staying and that we were holding a memorial. You never asked me whether he was dead. That truth moved through the room more sharply than any accusation. I walked to the front. You called me before sunrise. I told Lydia. You discussed the inheritance before asking where Dad was. You never asked to see him. For one moment, the performance left her face. We were drowning, she whispered. The condo, the credit cards, Grant's investments. He said we would replace everything before Dad noticed. I believed that this was how it had begun, not with a plan to destroy our father, but with fear given permission, one compromise at a time. Then she looked at me. If you had stayed out of it, nobody would have had to know. There was the choice she was still making. 2 investigators from the county sheriff's financial crimes unit entered from the rear of the hall. Evelyn had notified them that a disputed instrument might be used publicly, but they had made no promise of an arrest. The senior investigator asked Grant to place the will on the table and accompany them for a voluntary interview. He explained that evidence would be reviewed with the prosecutor. There were no handcuffs and no dramatic reading of rights, only the quiet beginning of consequences. Grant kept talking as they escorted him toward the door. It was temporary. I was investing it. I would have paid everything back. Dad watched him leave. You had my checkbook for 7 months, he said. The only thing you grew was my funeral. Outside, Lydia stood beside an investigator's car, waiting to answer questions. Dad approached her. His voice held grief, not triumph. You buried the wrong man, sweetheart. Lydia lowered her eyes. Behind us, the empty casket waited for someone who had finally reclaimed his own voice. Real consequences did not arrive that Sunday. They arrived through interviews, subpoenas, handwriting analysis, bank records, and hearings conducted beneath fluorescent lights. Justice was slower than the memorial and less satisfying to watch, but it was real. Grant was eventually charged with forgery, theft from an elderly person, and falsifying a loan application. He accepted a plea after the notary journal showed no legitimate meeting with Dad and electronic records connected his office computer to the disputed documents. Ohio's licensing authority revoked his mortgage loan originator license. Lydia was not treated as an innocent bystander or as the mastermind Grant had been. Messages showed that she knew Dad's money was paying their debts and helped isolate him when he asked questions. She pleaded guilty to a reduced complicity charge, received 3 years of community control, mandatory counseling, restitution, and community service with a senior support nonprofit. Between frozen accounts, the liquidation of GM Capital Holdings, the sale of the Florida condominium, and the bank's fraud settlement, Dad recovered $141 of the $187 taken. The HELOC was cancelled before funding. His house remained his. Evelyn helped him create a revocable living trust with an independent trust officer as successor trustee. Dad named me as healthcare agent, but required 2-person approval for large financial transfers. Love is not an internal control, he said. That's why banks have 2 keys. He returned to Millstone after the locks were changed by a locksmith he selected himself. Dad did not move back into the house immediately. For several weeks, he stayed with me while the locks, alarm codes, accounts, and medication records were secured. He also began counseling through the VA. He said he did not need therapy, then he attended every appointment. Betrayal had made him suspicious of closed doors and unanswered phones. Recovery meant admitting that surviving the scheme had not erased what isolation had done to him. Strength, I learned from watching him, was not the absence of injury. It was the willingness to stop pretending an injury deserved no care. Healing required time, witnesses, and choices he controlled. The first thing he did was carry Mom's mantel clock to a repair shop. A worn gear, not grief, neglect, or symbolism, had stopped it. 2 weeks later, he placed it back above the fireplace and wound it. The ticking filled the house. 8 weeks after the memorial, I met Lydia at her probation office. She looked smaller without Grant beside her. But being diminished was not the same as being changed. I gave her a copy of Mom's letter. Dad had added 1 sentence beneath Elaine's handwriting. Don't disappear inside your silence. That part was for you, too. Have you forgiven me? Lydia asked. Not yet. It was the most honest kindness I could offer. Pay the restitution, stay in counseling, learn to apologize without explaining what I did wrong first. When those things are real, you'll know where Dad and I live. She nodded. That was not reconciliation. It was a boundary with a door in it. Dad and Arthur began holding a monthly workshop at the VFW called Papers While You're Breathing. Evelyn explained powers of attorney and beneficiary forms. Denise taught families how to recognize isolation and questionable care placements. The county ombudsman distributed checklists for residents and caregivers. 11 people attended the first meeting. By the third, Arthur had to unfold extra chairs. One woman discovered that her nephew had redirected her statements. Another replaced an outdated power of attorney before a crisis made the decision urgent. Dad never used their stories as proof that his suffering had been worthwhile. Pain does not become good merely because someone learns from it. He only said that waste was optional. I accepted a permanent position at a Columbus hospital. I still had a career and my own apartment. But every Sunday I drove to Millstone. I did not return because Lydia had accused me of leaving. Presence is not a debt paid through guilt. It is a habit built through choice. Dad usually burned the bacon. The clock ticked above us while he complained about my coffee. And in his wallet he carried one pressed lily from the memorial. Best funeral I never had. He called it. My father did not teach me that family should be trusted without question. He taught me something kinder and harder. Love should protect a person's voice, not replace it. While people are still breathing, ask what they want. Then make certain their signature still belongs to them. My sister declared our father dead at 6:18 on a Friday morning. Dad was sitting 8 feet behind me at my kitchen table, spreading orange marmalade across a piece of toast with the concentration of a man defusing a small bomb. He wore a borrowed flannel shirt, jeans, and the gray wool socks I kept for winter guests. Steam rose from the mug beside his elbow. It was his first cup of coffee in months, and he had already complained that I made it too weak. I was standing at the stove in my Columbus apartment, turning bacon with one hand when my phone began vibrating against the counter. Lydia. Dad looked at the screen, then at me. Neither spoke. We had known this call might come, although we had not expected it before sunrise. I wiped my fingers on a dish towel, answered, and put the call on speaker. Nora, Lydia said. No hello, no question about whether I was awake. I placed the phone between the sugar bowl and Dad's coffee and rested my thumb over the mute button. Dad died last night. Her voice sounded exhausted, but not broken. There is a difference. I had spent 14 years listening to families receive news in hospital corridors. Grief rarely arrived in a recognizable shape, but it almost always disturbed the air around it. Lydia's voice disturbed nothing. Behind her, I heard a cabinet close and Grant murmur something I could not make out. I looked at Dad. He stopped spreading the marmalade. Arthur called me. Lydia continued. The VFW is handling the memorial on Sunday. Grant and I are taking care of everything else. Everything else. She let the words settle before telling me what they meant. Dad left the house, the accounts, and the old shop property to us. He was very clear. Don't come looking for something that was never meant for you. Grant moved closer to her phone. For once, Nora, let the people who stayed handle the family. That sentence was meant to wound me. And it did. Lydia had been using some version of it since our mother died. She stayed. I left. She carried the weight. I visited with an overnight bag and professional advice. Across the table, Dad set down his knife. The small click against the plate sounded louder than Grant's voice. He leaned toward my phone. I pressed mute. Dad spoke quietly, almost gently. It was one sentence, and I knew the moment I heard it that he had been saving it, not the words. Perhaps, but the truth inside them. Lydia did not hear him that morning. She would hear him 2 days later, standing in front of everyone whose sympathy she had accepted. I released the button. What happened? I asked, making my voice smaller than it was. There was a pause. Lydia had prepared for anger, not questions. He was gone before Arthur got there. She said, there was nothing anyone could do. She did not say where Dad had been. She did not mention a hospital, a doctor, or the last time she had seen him alive. She did not ask whether I wanted to see him. She did not offer me a photograph. a final message, or even a lie about his last words. Instead, she repeated, "The memorial is Sunday at 2. Then Grant added, "And don't bring a lawyer to a family service." That was the moment I understood the purpose of the call. Lydia was not telling me our father had died. She was trying to establish ownership before I could ask for proof. In her mind, Dad had already stopped being a person. He had become a house with no mortgage, 2 bank accounts, a strip of commercial land, and a signature she believed could no longer contradict her. I told her I would be there. When the call ended, Dad picked up a slice of bacon from my plate. "Cold," he said. "You're supposed to be dead." "Then I suppose cholesterol has lost jurisdiction." I laughed once, then covered my mouth because the sound came out too close to a sob. My sister had declared him dead before breakfast. What she did not know was that death was the only part of her paperwork she had not forged. To understand how a living man became an estate, you have to go back 9 months, to a ladder, a broken wrist, and a document so ordinary I might have signed it myself. My father, Samuel Whitaker, had never looked wealthy. He did not own a boat, wear a gold watch, or know what wine belonged with dinner. He owned 1 dark suit, 3 pairs of work boots, and a 1972 Chevrolet C10 he had restored bolt by bolt. His money was quieter. It lived in a paid-off house. Retirement accounts he rarely discussed. The proceeds from selling Whitaker Tool and Repair, and a narrow piece of commercial land behind the old shop. Dad called that being comfortable and having enough to share. Grant later called it an asset profile. Dad lived in Millstone, Ohio, nearly 2 hours northwest of Columbus. In the house he and Mom bought in 1985, where they raised us. They paid off the mortgage 17 years early because my mother, Elaine, treated interest like a personal insult. Mom died in March of 2023 after 10 months of ovarian cancer. Lydia carried more of those final months than I did. That truth belongs in any honest version of this story. She lived 12 minutes away. She managed grocery lists, laundry, medications, and the terrible midnight calls that make every ringing phone sound dangerous afterward. I came home whenever my schedule allowed. But whenever looks generous beside every day. At Mom's funeral, people thanked me for being the nurse in the family. They thanked Lydia for nothing because reliable women are often mistaken for furniture. I saw her face each time someone praised me, but I did not understand what was accumulating behind it. After Mom died, Dad stayed in the house. Every Saturday evening, he wound the wooden mantel clock she had inherited from her grandmother. Mom used to say a silent clock made a house feel abandoned. "It's not silent," Dad told me once. "It's resting." That's what you say about every broken thing you don't want to replace. Most things aren't broken. People just stop listening closely enough. In October of 2025, Dad climbed a ladder to clear leaves from the back gutter. The ladder shifted in damp soil. He fell 8 feet and landed on his right arm. I was on contract in Nashville, but reached the Dayton hospital the next afternoon. Dad had a complicated wrist fracture that required surgery, a stabilizing plate, and several weeks of rehabilitation. Lydia was adjusting his blanket when I entered. Grant stood by the window speaking with Dad's insurer. They looked tired, capable, and reassuring. Lydia hugged me. "You came fast." Of course I did. Something changed in her expression. So quickly I nearly missed it. Grant ended his call and handed me a neatly written list of Dad's medications, appointments, and insurance contacts. He had color-coded it. "I'll handle the bills and transportation," he said. "Lydia can focus on keeping him comfortable." Dad raised his uninjured hand. Apparently, falling off a ladder promoted everybody. We laughed, even Lydia. The surgeon expected a good recovery. But Dad could not drive, write checks, or manage the paperwork one-handed. He agreed to stay temporarily with Lydia and Grant. 2 days before I returned to Nashville, Grant arranged for a notary to visit. The document was a limited financial power of attorney. I read it myself. It authorized Grant to pay household expenses, renew insurance, and manage recovery-related costs while Dad's wrist healed. It did not transfer ownership. It did not authorize gifts, loans, property sales, beneficiary changes, or healthcare decisions. It was legal, specific, and boring. Dad read every page, because his right hand was wrapped and swollen. He signed with his left. The letters leaned awkwardly, but the signature was his. The notary checked his identification, watched him sign, and stamped the document. Nothing criminal happened that afternoon. That matters. Betrayal rarely enters a family carrying a crowbar. More often, it arrives with a casserole, a color-coded medication chart, and an offer to make life easier. The first moment that troubled me came later, while Grant and I stood near the elevator. Once Sam is settled, he said, we should probably review the primary asset. You mean Dad's house? He smiled. Mortgage brain, occupational hazard. It was a small thing, barely large enough to remember. But some words reveal the shelf where a person has placed you. That evening, Lydia posted a photograph of herself beside Dad's hospital bed. Her caption read, "Family shows up." I stared at it longer than I should have. She had stayed through Mom's illness. I had arrived with an overnight bag, professional questions, and a return ticket. Part of me believed I owed her the right to be trusted. Before I left, Dad squeezed my hand. Don't worry, kiddo, I'm surrounded by people who say they know what's best for me. At the time, I heard comfort. Later, I heard the warning hidden inside it. By November, Dad was living in Lydia and Grant's guest room. The arrangement was supposed to last until he could button a shirt, turn a key, and drive without pain. At first, the updates sounded reassuring. Lydia sent pictures of homemade soup and neatly folded towels. Grant texted photographs of prescription bottles lined up beside a weekly organizer. People from Millstone filled the comments beneath Lydia's posts with hearts and praise. I added my own. Thank you for taking care of him. I meant it. That is another truth I cannot edit out simply because I know how the story ends. I understood why the praise mattered to her. During Mom's illness, Lydia had become the dependable daughter people called without asking whether she was tired. I had become the impressive daughter they mentioned because nursing sounded noble. Lydia received chores, I received admiration. Neither role told the whole truth, but hers had cost more. When she said caring for Dad gave her purpose after Mom's death, I believed her. I did not yet understand how purpose could harden into possession. Then my Sunday calls began reaching Lydia instead of Dad. He's sleeping. Physical therapy wore him out. He just took his pain medication. For 3 weeks, I heard reports about my father without hearing his voice. His old flip phone was supposedly broken, so I bought him a smartphone, entered my number, enlarged the icons, and mailed it to Lydia's house. The package disappeared. I sent another with tracking. Delivered. Lydia said Dad had refused it. You know how he is with technology. My father had rebuilt a carburetor at 70 and installed his own video doorbell after watching one tutorial. He did not fear technology. He disliked being instructed by it. I asked for a video call. Lydia said the Wi-Fi was unreliable. I asked for the name of his physical therapist. Grant said medical privacy rules prevented the office from speaking to me. That answer was technically true and deliberately misleading. Dad could have authorized the conversation in 30 seconds. I knew something was wrong. I also knew the limits of what I could do from another state. Dad was a competent adult staying with family by choice. No agency investigates a sister for answering a telephone too often. Concern is not evidence, and distance can make even a nurse doubt her instincts. I came home for Christmas. Dad's cast was gone, but his chair had been moved to the corner of Lydia's living room. Away from the conversation, he looked thinner. When relatives asked about his wrist, Lydia answered before he could. Healing beautifully, aren't you, Daddy? Grant handed him decaf and called it doctor's orders. Dad and I escaped to the back porch by pretending we wanted fresh air in 28-degree weather. Through the glass door, I could see Lydia watching us while drying the same plate twice. How are you really? I asked. Dad flexed his recovering hand. Wrist is getting stronger. Checkbook's been on a diet. He tried to smile, but I heard the warning this time. His bank statements no longer came to the house. Grant had switched everything to paperless billing, and the passwords lived on Grant's laptop. Dad had asked twice to review his accounts. Both times, Grant had clapped him on the shoulder and said, "That's what you've got me for. Do you want me to step in?" Dad looked through the window at Lydia. She was setting out Mom's pecan pie recipe, the one she had made alone during Mom's last Christmas. "I want to know whether I'm ungrateful or being managed," he said. "I haven't figured out which." Inside, I asked if we could review the accounts together after dinner. Grant appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Family doesn't need lawyers, Nora, unless you're accusing somebody." I had not mentioned a lawyer. Lydia began crying, not theatrically this time. She listed the months beside Mom's bed, the medications, the laundry, and all the nights I had been elsewhere. Every item was true. She had turned her sacrifice into a ledger, and I had no clean answer to it. Dad placed his good hand over mine. "Not at Christmas, kiddo." So I stopped. On January 6th, I signed another 13-week nursing contract in Nashville. The money would finally clear the remainder of my student loans. I told myself I could help Dad better once I was free of them. It was a reasonable decision. Reasonable decisions can still become regrets. By February, the calls no longer felt merely screened. They felt scripted. Lydia supplied details before I asked. Grant ended conversations whenever Dad approached, and Dad's own voice had vanished behind a wall built from concern, exhaustion, and perfect manners. I decided my next visit would not be announced. I took 4 days off between shifts and drove to Millstone without telling anyone. Lydia opened her front door, saw my overnight bag, and recovered from her surprise almost instantly. "You just missed him." Dad went on an overnight fishing trip with the VFW guys. It was February in Ohio. The ponds were edged with ice. "Which guys?" "Arthur and some others. You don't know everyone he knows, Nora." I drove to Dad's house instead. The mailbox was packed. Frost-silvered grass that had grown too long before winter, and the curtains were closed in every room. The house looked less abandoned than paused, as if it were waiting for someone to finish a sentence. At a gas station outside town, I saw Arthur Bell beside the coffee machine. Arthur had served with Dad at the VFW and spent 40 years directing funerals, which gave him a patient way of looking at people who were avoiding the truth. "Sam hasn't attended a post-meeting since November," he said. "We thought he was staying with you." I called Lydia from the parking lot. She changed the story without changing her tone. "Not the VFW men," she explained. "Other friends. People I did not know." 3 days later, she texted a photograph of Dad in an armchair. "Dad's doing great. Please stop checking up on us." He was smiling, but only with his mouth. Behind him sat a blue plastic water pitcher marked with 3 white letters, CHM. I enlarged the picture, stared at the letters, and decided they were probably a manufacturer's logo. The photograph should have relieved me. Instead, I noticed that Dad wore the same green shirt Lydia had shown in 2 earlier pictures, supposedly taken weeks apart. A beige handrail crossed the wall behind his chair. Still, photographs flatten context, and suspicion can turn objects into evidence. I saved the image rather than confronting her. It joined the unanswered calls and missing phones in a folder I had not decided to build. I wanted to believe the ordinary explanation. In early May, my contract ended. I had barely unpacked in Columbus when Denise Harper called. We had worked together years earlier on a medical surgical floor. Denise was now a nurse at Crest Haven Manor, a long-term care facility near the Indiana line. Her voice was careful. "Nora, we have a resident named Samuel Whitaker. He asks every nurse whether we know his daughter. He says she's an RN in Columbus." The room seemed to tilt around me. "How long has he been there?" "Since March." No one had ever mentioned Crest Haven. Denise lowered her voice before adding, "He doesn't present like someone who needed placement. He presents like someone who was misplaced." I drove 3 hours without calling Lydia. Crest Haven stood behind a roadside sign with 2 burned-out letters. Inside, unanswered call lights blinked above a hall that smelled of disinfectant and old carpet. I counted too few aides for too many rooms. That was not the workers' failure. It was the mathematics of an understaffed building. Dad was in the second bed of a shared room. He had lost weight. Gray stubble covered his jaw. And his shirt fit like something borrowed from a man who had not returned for it. His eyes found mine. "Took you long enough, kiddo." They had told him I approved the placement. They said my career mattered more than he did. His phone had never broken. Lydia had taken it. Neither smartphone reached him, and the 4 letters I mailed had disappeared. In March, Grant had described Cresthaven as a 2-week rehabilitation stay while repairs were made to Lydia's guest room. 2 weeks became 10. Dad kept my old number on a torn envelope in his wallet. But outgoing calls required staff assistance he rarely received. I asked him the date, the president, and our location. Then I made him count backward by 7s. "I'm in Ohio. It's Tuesday, and this quiz is insulting." His mind was intact. He glanced toward the door. Whatever paper they used, I never signed another power of attorney. The administrator insisted Grant was the responsible party. I asked whether Dad had any diagnosis of dementia, incapacity, or cognitive impairment. He had none. A competent adult could discharge himself. When the administrator hesitated, I offered to call Ohio's long-term care ombudsman and review the admission file together. 20 minutes later, Dad signed his discharge with his healed right hand. "First thing I've signed in months," he said. "Might as well make it a jailbreak." On the highway to Columbus, he watched the fields pass in silence. Then he said, "They think I'm still filed away." He looked at me, and the old steadiness had returned to his face. "Let's not correct them yet." I brought Dad to my apartment, refilled his blood pressure medication, and gave him the pull-out couch. He objected to the couch, the size of my television, and the fact that I owned only one decent frying pan. He did not object to the coffee. After 10 weeks of institutional decaf, he held the first mug in both hands and closed his eyes as if I had returned something sacred.